Yeah, thanks, Noah. That was really good. I'm going to take a little bit different approach. Where Noah focused on what he's doing specifically, I'm going to do more of an overarching thoughts here. So just a little bit about me and what we've got going on here. My brothers and I farm under JL Acres LLC. So there's the three of us brothers there. We grew up on an organic dairy farm in Sterling, Illinois. So we are just off of Interstate 88. So about an hour from the Wisconsin border, 45 minutes from the Quad Cities, if you can kind of imagine that area. My parents transitioned to organic around 2008 or so, kind of when I was in high school. And then my brothers and I were involved in that time. We went off to college, came back after some years' experience off the farm, and we were farming for a few years before we have formed our official LLC, but it was formed in 2019. You can see there, excuse me, we've got experience raising a number of different crops, some for many years, some for just a couple years. Your normal corn, soybeans, wheat, hybrid rye. We've tried spelt and barley just one or two times just to kind of play around with it. We've considered other crops. We haven't quite made the jump into some of them yet, but we'll talk about that a little bit as we go here. So the first thing to think about when you are doing an organic farm is a diverse crop rotation. And I'm going to talk about crop succession more than crop rotation. So we want to rotate our crops or have a succession of different crops because of weed control, because of soil health, healthy ecosystems, to provide opportunities for different cover crops. Of course, it spreads out the risk a little bit in terms of when things are going to be ready to harvest or growing or not growing, cash flow, equipment, diversifies income streams. The other thing that I think isn't talked about enough is the ability to be connected with more buyers or end users, and even other farmers. You have questions about growing a different crop, and so you reach out. You maybe find a buyer, and maybe they're also buying other crops, and it gives you an ability to shop around a little bit when you're selling things. And crop rotations also make organic inspectors happy. That's always important too. So what crops are possible in the Midwest? What are some different things we can think about adding to our crop rotations or crop successions? So I've got just some ideas to think about here, and I broke this out into even further subcategories. So we've got our corn, and we can have feed grade corn, food grade corn. Depending on your markets, you also have popcorn and silage. Each of those might be treated a little bit differently and have different agronomic principles or considerations. Same with soybeans, feed grade, food grade. They're going to grow pretty similar. Your market's going to be a little bit different. When we get into the small grains, we get a lot of variety in agronomic practices, harvest windows. So for example, in our area, we're planting a lot of winter wheat. So we're looking at more work in the fall compared to oats would be less work in the fall, maybe more work in the spring. But then also your harvest for oats is going to be a little bit later too. And so all these different factors with small grains, you can have that in the rotation, but depending on the small grain you might use, it might affect the overall flow of weeds and fertility, planting, harvesting. Same with forage. So with the dairy, we have the ability to grow hay and alfalfa. There's also opportunities potentially, depending on what livestock you're using, to grow forage sorghum, sorghum sudan grass, teff, different millets, or perennial grasses, and not just legume forages. And then also thinking about pasture as a possibility. So those are pretty standard Midwest crops. But there's also some other possibilities depending on your market and locations. So we have grown field peas a few times. There's an opportunity to grow them as food grade field peas, as well as cover crop seed, depending on your market. Sunflowers we've had in our rotation. Edible beans are possible. Canola is making its way into the Midwest. Buckwheat is something that can be grown. We have had a few people approach us in the last year or two asking about growing hemp, for both hemp seed and the fiber market. So this is not CBD, this is not THC, this is industrial hemp usage. We haven't done that, but that option is coming. There could potentially be other options depending on where you're at in the upper Midwest. Flax, camelina for cover crop seed possibly, or oil markets, sorghum, milo, millet. You can see the list there. So we can think a little bit beyond just regular corn, soybeans, small grains. break that into further subcategories, and then even some alternative crops, and then look at what might those offer us in terms of coming up with a crop succession plan. So here's a few tips, just one slide on if you're going to grow some alternative crops, you need to know your strengths and weaknesses. So if you're going to stray away from your typical corn, soybeans, small grain, you need to know what you do well. Are you somebody that is good on agronomy? You know those different things. And if so, great, you can focus on that. Maybe weed control is something that you're really good at, but you're not as good on agronomy. So maybe you need to hire a consultant to advise you on some agronomic practices. Are you good at marketing? Is that something that needs to be outsourced possibly? And then two, what is your storage availability? Do you have storage? Does it need to move off the farm at harvest, or can you keep that to market it? Neighborhood connections, equipment, you can kind of see the list there. Labor situation is also part of that. So it all kind of boils down to be aware of what you can do well and what you can't do well. If there's a thing that you can invest in, if you can put the time into learning about different agronomy or put some time into some better weed control measures, you can focus on that. Or is it something that you need to outsource? Do you need to hire a neighbor to come do weed zapping? Do you need to hire somebody to come and graze livestock? I think that's a great possibility that Noah has there, working with somebody to do the hay for him, because hay takes a lot of different equipment and time. So look at where you can outsource possibly or partner with other people when you go into some crops that you're not as familiar with growing. So here's some different considerations for designing a crop succession. I'm talking about succession more than rotation. We'll see that in just a little bit. So we can use our different rotations to combat weeds. That picture there, I know it's probably pretty small on your screens. That is a great example of TH Fabrication's in-row rotary hoe. You can see it did a pretty good job of keeping the foxtail out of the soybeans, but there's a lot right next to the row, and I could talk about the pluses and minuses of that tool if anybody wanted, but we're combating weeds with our rotations. So when you're thinking about what crops you might want to grow or how to set up your rotation, we look at it on a field-by-field basis. So at the end of the year or in the middle of the year, we say, okay, what fields had a lot of problems with weeds? What specific weeds were the problem? And then, so for example, we're looking at our foxtail. Those are going to go to seed a little bit later in the year. Same with your ragweeds, things like that. What tools or strategies do you have to manage those weeds? Is this a weed that I can take care of with cultivation or tine weeding, better spring practices? Is this a weed that maybe I can weed zap, or a weed that I can smother out with a good dense small grain crop? And so then you look at what crops rotations fit with those weeds. So here's some examples. Ragweed I know is one that a lot of us organic producers can struggle with sometimes, giant ragweed. And in our area, we have some ragweed that germinates really early, and we have some that germinates really late in the season. But in general, ragweed is only going to set seeds late in the summer, and it grows tall. It germinates from deep, but its seed also has a short seed survival rate in general. So we think about, if that's our weed that we have an issue with in a field, what are some crops that we could maybe only use half of the season, or crops that we could get through with a weed zapper or a cutter or even a walking crew. So thinking about small grains, soybeans, peas, buckwheat, alfalfa, maybe sunflowers, depending on what type of ragweed you have. If it's just the early germinating one versus a later germinating ragweed. Similar with foxtail. So ragweed, you might have a harder time eliminating with tine weeding, so it's going to be an issue if it's going to grow kind of regardless of what tillage practices you might use. Foxtail, on the other hand, germinates from a shallower position. The seed also has a shorter survival rate, but it's also going to be more likely to persist. So if you have foxtail in, for example, a hayfield, you really have to be careful about mowing that off, because it will set seeds as late as it possibly can and maybe only grow 3 inches tall and set 10 or 15 seeds, and while there's more seeds in the seed bank. So it can be a hard one to manage with just alfalfa or hay if you don't have a good stand there. But again, we could look at small grains that are then going to a cover crop that could really smother things. Alfalfa can work if it's a good heavy thing, or planting row crops a little bit later, because foxtail, sometimes it'll germinate slower in the spring, or slower with warmer soils, to give you more opportunity to manage that with some tillage and tine weeding passes and such. I don't have a bullet point there for the burr cucumber. That one just came into our area in the last couple of years. Some floodwaters from a giant rain brought it down the creek into a bunch of our fields. But that's another one of those crops that germinates very late in the season, in your July, August timeframe. So we're looking at doing some more small grains or things that we are going to take off, and we can keep that area mowed, till it repeatedly if we have to, but basically just try to exhaust the burr cucumber by looking at what we can do in our rotation to put crops there that will allow us to manage those weeds. So the other thing that we can think about with our rotation is providing fertility and soil health. So of course we have some different crops, different cover crops that are known to have fertility benefits. Your clovers, legumes, oats and buckwheat with their acidifying roots, sunflowers and brassicas with their deep tap roots, and also the deep tap roots breaking compaction, but then also bringing up nutrients. Brassicas sometimes accumulating sulfur in their roots. I talked about deep compaction. Sunflower, safflower has a really good penetrating root. Sorghum, again, brassicas. We can think about tilth in our soils, the crumbliness of the soils. Peas and clovers and some grasses will help with that. And then again, weed suppression with different crops. Rye with its allelopathic tendencies, buckwheat, sorghums for Canadian thistles, some things of that nature. So these are some things I think about when I'm planning my crop succession. I think about, okay, what worked and what didn't work this past year. For example, we thought that we had a crew that could come in and do some field walking in a sunflower field. We knew there was going to be ragweed pressure there. We were planning on hiring this crew to come in. They got tied up in another place, and by the time they got to the sunflower field, the ragweed was really tall, and it was really expensive for them to go in and try to clear out that ragweed. So that did not necessarily work as well as we thought it might. What were the problem weeds or the fields that had the biggest problems? And then what is needed to combat those weeds and fields? We can also talk about a little bit, obviously we can look at our soil nutrition and how that plays into weed management, but I think because fertility is sometimes a long game, like thinking about bringing up calcium solubility levels, that's going to be a 2 to 5 year game of adding calcium year after year. But what can we do in the short term to grow crops that we can manage our weeds with differently or better? And then again, what management tools are going to work best for what weeds? Ragweed is not going to be taken out by a tine weeder. Foxtail is much more likely to be taken out with a tine weeder. Again, things like that. The other thing that's really important is, what is the market telling me? Where can I market my crops? What can I get a good price for? So these are some different examples of what a rotation could look like. There are unfortunately, some people in the organic world that are somehow able to slip by with just doing a corn-soybean rotation. I'm not sure how they get that by their inspectors, but I am aware of that happening. And I wouldn't really call that a rotation either. Then a more rotation, we've got our traditional corn, soybeans, and our small grain. We can add in cover crops in there. So corn, cover crop, soybeans, small grain with a cover crop in there, either frost seeded or afterwards. We can look at corn, soybeans, small grain, alfalfa. Of course, we're getting more complex here. Okay, let's add in an alternative crop. We've got our corn, some field peas, possibly after that. We could do a cover crop after that, soybeans, small grain cover crop. We can try to do sunflowers in there. This is a rotation that we had kind of looked at doing when wheat wasn't cash flowing the best. We looked at maybe just pulling wheat out of the rotation and doing sunflowers instead. Weed management has kind of told us that that's not going to be the best long-term rotation, to just replace sunflowers with wheat or small grain. We can work at double cropping possibly, with field peas, double crop sunflowers. Again, you can get really creative with this, thinking about the different ways these different crops impact weeds and fertility and cover crop opportunities. And if you wanted to get corn, so I've started most of these with corn as the starting thing. You could imagine a rotation that doesn't have any corn at all. So depending on your markets, maybe your upper Midwest, you have this opportunity. You could do a field pea. Canola double crop sunflower is going to be risky because of white mold, but you could maybe get by with it for a season. And then maybe go into a small grain alfalfa. You can kind of play around with some different possibilities there. So these are some of our actual crop successions. And the reason why I talk about crop successions more than rotations is when my parents transitioned in 2008, we had about 15 to 20 fields. And over these last years, I don't think we've had a single field that has had an actual rotation where it's kind of been, boom, 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 this is the pattern. We've always ended up changing fields because of either weed pressure, fertility needs, feed needs for the dairy, and different things like that. And then, of course, my brothers and I have formed our own farming entity, and we have our own acres. And again, we're kind of looking more at between what are the weed pressures, market pressures, and fertility needs, looking at crop successions. So these are some actual things that we have done on our farm. We had a field that was corn, then it was field peas, and we double cropped corn after the field peas. With the dairy, we are able to chop that corn. It did not reach maturity, but there was feed value out there. So we double cropped corn after the field peas. Soybeans, back to corn, put some cover crop rye. Soybeans, it's currently planted to wheat. And then we may go back to alfalfa on that field. We may go to corn. It kind of depends on what our alfalfa fields look like. If one of those is ready to be turned out and put into corn, or if we need additional alfalfa planted. So here's another one that we've got. This one has not had corn on this field. The landlord says they have grandkids running around. They don't want them to get lost in the cornfield, so we plant all low crops. Soybeans, field peas, 3 years of alfalfa, soybeans, wheat with an underseeding of clover. Clover was worked under. The field is currently in hybrid rye. We might go back to alfalfa with that field is kind of where we're thinking. Another one that we have done in the way is we had corn with a cover crop of rye, soybeans to sunflowers, cover crop rye after that, soybeans. Right now that field is in wheat. And that will probably go back to corn following the wheat in that particular field. Some other thoughts. That picture up in the corner is, for some reason, we had some radishes that overwintered one year and went to seed, and we planted the field in corn, and those radishes grew up amongst the corn. It would be an interesting thing to actually try to do that intentionally. It slightly hindered the corn growth, but it was kind of an interesting look to have the radishes growing underneath the corn there. Other thoughts, just to diversify your cropping system in general, is to look at intercropping. I know there's a lot of this happening in the upper Midwest into Canada, but even in our own area, we have grown oats and peas together just as a feed for our livestock, and it's worked well. I know some people that grow oats and peas together that clean them and separate them in this northern Illinois region. Wheat and peas is something that has been talked about. We have not tried it, but it's a potential possibility. You're probably going to hurt your wheat stand by seeding peas in the spring, but it might be a possibility to look into. Soybeans and oats is something that I've heard people toy around with a little bit. I don't know how successful that really would be, but you could get creative. Same with soybeans and buckwheat. And then we already saw Noah's working with a small grain and soybean relay situation. Marketing is, of course, going to be an issue if you're going to try some of these other crops besides corn, soybeans. Is there an opportunity possibly in your area? Maybe you don't know of livestock personally, but maybe there's a feed mill in the area, and you can become acquainted with a nutritionist that works there and work with them to maybe get some of your crops into a local feed market by working with a nutritionist. Are there farmer marketing groups in around? I know O-Farm is one group that helps to market farmers different diverse crops. Is there a possibility that you can, I spelled that sentence wrong there, but is it possible that you could direct too many crops are not consumed? I don't know what I meant by that. But it could be that you're growing a crop that could be direct marketed to consumers, is maybe where I was trying to go with that sentence. Or maybe if you're a large enough scale, is there an export opportunity to send it overseas or to a different country? And then, of course, when you're looking at diversifying beyond just kind of a standard rotation of your corn, soybeans, and into small grains, know the risks that you're comfortable taking. So some crops are covered by crop insurance. Others, you need to build a cropping history first before your crop insurance will cover it. So for example, in our area of Illinois, sunflowers are not an insured crop. But if we grow sunflowers for 3 years and document the yields that we got off of that, then they can become an insured crop. That's the way it works for any crop in, well, I'm going to say pretty much any crop in any area. You can work with your local crop insurance office and document, if you want to try a new crop or get a new crop established in the area, document the yields over, I believe it's 3 years, and then it can become a crop that is established and you can get some crop insurance coverage from that. But you're taking a risk in those years that you're growing it without having that insurance coverage. Also know when you're trying something new, failure is definitely a possibility. And livestock definitely makes it easier to clean up any messes that you might have. So these are some other, if there's any big thinkers out there or people with some deep pockets, I just threw this slide together to try to encourage people to think about how we could get some other markets going to grow more diverse organic rotations. So these are some things that I think would help or benefit the organic world in general. I think we need more diverse grains in animal rotations, or in animal rations. More diverse grains in animal rations. Besides just soybeans, wheat, and corn, we need to look at how we can get hybrid rye in particular, I think, has a lot of benefits. Not cereal rye because of some issues with poultry, but hybrid rye, I think, has a lot of benefits for animal rations. And even looking at other alternative crops, you know, if we can get peas into different animal rations. We need to look at ways of getting more diverse grains into our human foods and food systems. And I think we also, this might be a controversial point, but I think we need to work at developing more non-food organic crop markets. So thinking about, particularly in the fiber market, flax and hemp and even cotton. I know there is an organic cotton market, but really developing places where we can add in other crops that are, because right now so much of the organic market is tied to livestock. Yes, there's a lot that goes into the food market. My sense would be majority of the dollars is going into the organic vegetable market and not as much into the organic grain market. The majority of the organic grains, your corn, soybeans, those are going to feed animals. And that is going to be always a little bit of a bottleneck if there's ever a hiccup in the organic livestock world, as we saw when there was poultry farms that were reduced because of flu outbreaks. If there'd ever be issues with milk consumption, we saw a lot of dairies, being a dairy ourselves, a lot of dairies pulled back on the amount of soy meal that they were feeding because it got too expensive the last couple of years. And so then that affects soy prices. So I think we need to look at developing non-food organic crops and how that could impact our overall cropping systems and soil health and environmental health. And then also, I know Albert Lee is working at some of this, but more hybrid options for growing shorter season crops further south. So looking at cover crop opportunities, if there would be a way that I could plant, you know, an 85-day corn or even a 90-day corn, my typical corn is going to be in that 105 to 108-day range. If I could plant a 90-day corn and have it yield just as well or with a very small yield reduction, but allow for different cover crop opportunities, I think that would be definitely a great possibility just to help with our overall cropping systems and weed management, being able to play around with the timing of harvesting and even planting some of our crops. So there's, just briefly, I'm putting that out there. If anybody wants to contact me directly with any questions, we've got our farm website there. I have a few videos on YouTube. I really didn't get any done this last year. I have some pictures on Instagram. But in general, that's where you can find me. So with that, we'll see if there's any questions.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Jacob. All right. So just kind of throw one out there to you. Have you seen more white mold in your soybeans after sunflowers? It seems that one person seemed to see more white mold after that rotation. And Noah, if you have anything to add to that, you're more than welcome to chime in as well.
Yeah. As near as I could tell, we did not have white mold, or we have not had white mold in our soybeans following sunflowers. I think a large help for that was we've had very dry years the last few years since we've got really heavy into sunflowers. The one field where we did have some white mold issues has not had a history of sunflowers. It was actually an irrigated field, and I think just that extra moisture helped with the white mold issue. But in general, we have not had that problem so far.
Another one that came in, someone planted soybeans with corn and put it into a silage pit, and they fed it to their beef herd. The beef herd were really sick and slick and slimy. Sorry, slick and slimy. They grew very well and healthy. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you probably had a lot of fat and oils in the soybeans, which is great. You're going to get a lot of protein in there too. I'm not a dairy nutritionist, to be honest. My brother is the one that takes care more of the livestock things, and I'm more on the crop side of our operation. So I know it's definitely possible. I know of some people also growing like forage sorghum or even sorghum with their silage to harvest. With soybeans, if you've got a lot of soybeans, you maybe have to watch your moisture on your silage, but I think that's great. Yeah, work with a nutritionalist. Don't take my advice on that.
So have you considered doing a corn, small grain, bean rotation, and with the idea of using the grains to wipe out weeds ahead of beans?
Yeah, so we have planted wheat after corn. And I know some people say that's an issue with rust and different diseases, but that hasn't been an issue for us. In some ways, weeds can do more damage than disease in an organic system. So we have planted small grains after corn and then gone to soybeans as a way of, helping to clean up weeds. That's an option, yeah.
All right, thank you. And then we'll just kind of finish up with one more here. Jacob, what have your gross and net returns been from sunflowers?
Yeah, I'd have to go back and look at our exact numbers. And I'll start with this answer and then I'll go to where we're going with that. Sunflowers can net pretty good. In general, the way that we look at them in terms of a cash flow or in terms of our profitability per acre is we lose less money growing sunflowers than we lose growing wheat. I'll phrase it that way. So with our yields and our context, unless you're able to pull off all that wheat straw and sell that wheat straw for a good amount of money, we're going to be more likely to break even and make a little bit of profit with the sunflowers, whereas opposed to the wheat with our land costs and yields and markets, we're probably going to lose money almost every year. We're going to probably lose money on wheat. We probably won't lose money. We might make a little bit of profit on the sunflowers. Now that said, with current market conditions with sunflowers, we are probably not going to grow sunflowers. Well, between market conditions and just where some of our rotations are at, we're probably not going to grow sunflowers this next year, and maybe not for the following year, just kind of thinking about where our rotation is and some of our other crop needs and things. But that's kind of how we look at sunflowers is they're a different crop that provides something different to the soil, but it's not going to be a high money-making crop necessarily, but not as likely to lose us money as some small grains in our area are.